use this terrain, and the idea was a lot of fun, but finding the fun was very, very difficult, and also level design was incredibly hard. So I want to talk about that, not to dissuade you from trying to do a strategy game, but to make sure that, to impart what I learned about keeping in mind that it's hard to find the fun. I'll get into it.
And the game that my team worked on was a 2D pixel platformer, and yeah, it's a pixel platformer. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about, it's very important, and I think it's crucial for designers. And it's when you work in a team, you want to make people care and feel ownership over the project, because if you don't, people are not gonna care about what you say, and if you build a GDD, they're not gonna read it because they don't care. And I have been learning recently how to make that happen. And this is a circle that Craig Morrison gives in his class. If you don't know him, he's the design director or leader for World of Warcraft in Blizzard. So he's a really, really smart guy. And so there's this circle that is the why, how, and what. So when you're trying to make a game and you're trying to build your pillars and you're trying to get everybody together, you want to think about your why. You want to think about why should we build this game and why do people care? Like, why is this game a good idea? And then your how is the process. Is it going to be like a procedurally generated game? Is it going to have multiple player choices? Is it going to empower the player? That's like how is that going to happen? And then what is like the product? Like, what is the result of this? Like, what is the end game? Another thing to consider is when you're trying to make this, as designers, we know that we don't know everything, and anything can be applied to design. Your teammates have skills that we do not have, right? It's just a reminder. So your getting your teammates involved in the design can only improve the game. If we all care, at the end of the day, we all want to do a great game. So the more brains will ever work better than one.
It's a common misconception that you, as a designer, have the ownership over the project's direction and its conception, how the mechanics work, and all that. But the bottom line is that you want, especially in a small project, you want everyone to feel like they are contributing to the end project on a direct level. So you want to make sure that your programmers, your artists, your audio people, your writers, they have an influence on the design. You want to have meetings, you want to share what you're thinking, why you're thinking about the decisions that you're thinking about, and also get their input. Because like Luis said, there are a lot of things, a lot of skills that you don't have, a lot of knowledge that you don't have that your other team members have. And so it's really important to get that information from them. And like you said, focus on that why, of like, why are you making this game? And if that why is strong in each member of your team, then they will all go out of their way to add to your project.
All right. So I just want to talk about the game, Chibinu. So while making this game, we learned a lot about level design, and basically, when I was making levels, it was like a weird process of improving, and this is a trap that a lot of designers fall into, and using internal programmers, is that when you're working on a game, you are going to inevitably improve as a designer, programmer, artist, and then you're gonna look back some months ago, and you're gonna be very tempted to go back and fix things, and that's basically a never-ending loop. However, there's some times when that is actually worth doing, so you gotta have a reason why you want to go back and change things. If the reason is not good enough, then it's not worth doing, but it's like a weird balance. So in this game, we had basically 3 different chapters, which is different zones/worlds. And what I wanted to show the player is that in each chapter, as I was making the game, I realized it's better in a platformer that is a small team to just introduce a mechanic in one chapter and evolve that mechanic over time. The other way to do it is to make a new mechanic in each level and then just keep recycling, kind of like counting Nintendo does. But in VGDC projects and mostly like indie games, there's not that much hand power. So reusing stuff is kind of like good in a way because it's easier, and at the same time it's also elegant because the player is now introduced to a mechanic and they can evolve and be challenged into more things with it. So in the first chapter, I had mechanics that were only introduced in that chapter, and they only existed in that chapter. Chapter 1 had mushrooms, which basically just make you jump higher. Chapter 2 had flutes that were basically platforms because it was some sort of like musical city. And chapter 3 was a castle, and we have a laser that instantly kills you, right? So those were the 3 mechanics that were unique for each chapter, and they didn't intertwine in other chapters, right? The problem that I found midway in development that was like a big mistake for me was that if you're making a game that gives the player some sort of like ability, you want to encourage them to use that ability, right? And I kind of understood it better as I was developing more and more levels. So for example, if we start in chapter 3, you get a partner that gives you a shield that makes you immune, and in that whole chapter you have a lot of lasers, and the only way to go to them or make it easier is by using the shield ability. So at this point, we're encouraging the player to use the ability that they just got, which is probably what they want to do. While in chapter 1, we had a mushroom, and the mushroom doesn't really connect to the ability of the player, which is the fireball. So that's kind of like risky to do because then we're not encouraging the player to use this ability, and the mushroom can feel kind of like disconnected from the level. Yeah. By the way, if you have any comments, questions, concerns, feel free to bring it. Okay. So this is like a better example. So this is one of the worlds in chapter 2, and like right here we have a very interesting story to tell the player. It's like you have to time your jump through the flutes, and there's enemies flying around, and you can jump in them. So if you don't have the dash ability, you can actually solve this little puzzle right here, and it's hard, but it's kind of doable. However, if you have the dash ability, it's actually easier for the players to do it, and you have more options to do. So often in playtests, I will have people try to do it without their dash ability, and then they will fail at it, and they will be like, okay, no, I'm gonna use my dash ability. So that's like a good example because you are encouraging the player to use the ability that you are hoping for them to have. However, just like a fine tuning of forcing an ability into the player and giving them multiple options. Because a big mistake in design is to go against player behavior. If you go against player behavior, you will always lose because people want to do what they want to do, and it doesn't matter what I want to tell them. They always went against it. So in chapter 3, for example, we have this this little level story scenario in which you can use the laser to jump through the bottom part of the level, but you could very much use your jump and your dash ability to dash between spikes. And you can also solve the problem with having triple jump and just having like a more slow, steady, secure path. So when you're making levels, you kind of want to think about these things. And if you guys came to the last workshop on level design, the one in week 1, we talk about sometimes when you're playtesting, you want to like observe this very carefully because you might find your player trying to solve a puzzle a specific way that you never thought about because we are all different, people think different. And that might be something very cool. You might find a way that people are interpreting your level, and you can build on it and allow them to solve the puzzle that way if it doesn't get too much in the story that you're trying to evoke in the level. Okay. So this is a really important topic. UI and UX is very important to your game, and more often than not, we often just throw it away and just hide it until week 9, week 8 to build it. And that's kind of like a bad thing to do because your UI and your UX should be a bridge between you and the game, right? You don't want your UI to feel intrusive and to just be like a window that pops in front of the screen that breaks the magic circle or the game feel, right? You want something that goes with the game and it can actually create some really cool design. So in this game, it's all about magic, and you have partners with different abilities. So we as a team decided to make a book because that would make sense. Instead of opening a pause menu, you have a book that you can open in Checkpoint, And when you look through partners, you kind of like flip a page, and it just feels very nice. Everybody loved it, and it even has like a cool video showing you the abilities that you have. Then for the checkpoints, we have an actual like magic stone that even has like a particle effect. So all these game elements that you have that can be in many games, you can actually change them to fit the aesthetic or the seed of your game, and it would just make the whole game feel better and more holistic, more united.
I want to add something to that real quick. This is UI and UX is something that's always scared me, and I always avoid it. But at some point, I had the realization that, like, whenever you play a game that you find like online or whatever in like someone's prototype or whatever, and it has those like white like Unity boxes, there's something that just clicks in the brain where you're like, where like it doesn't feel like a real game. It's like, oh, this is clearly just like just a prototype that someone's testing, and like. And I didn't really realize that, but whenever I saw like someone playing, making a YouTube video of them playing like an indie game, and it has those Unity boxes that's just like white, like plain UI with like Arial font, I would just be always like, oh yeah, that's like a shitty indie project that someone didn't put effort into. And then even when you don't upgrade the art and you upgrade the UI, like suddenly something changes. And that happened with my game. I didn't do a slide on it. Sorry for hijacking.
No,
while I'm thinking about it. Our game like didn't feel like a game at all. It was just like a collection of mechanics, and you had like these gameplay loops, and it was a game, but it didn't feel like it. And then we did the UI, and suddenly it felt like a game, and suddenly people started taking it seriously. So just something to think about.
So I don't know if you guys know Magic. One of the lead designers and creator right now is Mark Rosewater, and he said something very interesting in one of his GDCs. And he said that the player falls in love with your game through the details, and that can connect to player feedback, and that is very true. When we were playtesting the game and while developing the game, we tried really hard to create these details so the players can like fall in love with the environment. And the people thought that it was like pretty and it just fit the aesthetic. So it's kind of hard to see, but every time you kill an enemy, there's like a particle effect system that appears and it just bursts. It just gives you the satisfying feel of you kill the enemy. When you walk close enough to birds, we actually have birds like flying away, and it randomizes them in the level, so it's not like always there. Same thing with the fireball. Once it clashes, it just makes a particle effect. So this doesn't just make the game feel prettier and more complete, but it also actually helps through the whole understanding of the game. It creates feedback through something that is not sounds, which is always good because you play might be playing your game in mute or listening to their favorite compositions, like I do often, and the game just becomes more clear as a whole, and it just becomes more unified. So this is like a very interesting one. Help your team visualize the idea. So you as a designer, one of the things you have to be able to do, and also as a team member in general, is to be able to express what you have in your head. Because I don't know, you might probably go into this, but a big mistake when you're doing game dev is to have too many assumptions in pre-production. And that kind of like leads to a lot of issues and a lot of fixing in the future. So being as clear as possible is great to have everybody on the same page. So I have like a scenario right here. I say, like if we told the artist at some point, hey artist, can you make a Seiran boss? The artist will be like, okay, like how does it look? Like what does it do? Because all these pictures are very much different type of Seirans, right? So just conveying it through words is not enough. That's why it's really good when you're doing game development to have a meeting actually to talk about the design, so everybody can bring their ideas and everybody can be in the same page. So actually, yeah. Okay. So when we did that, this is the drawing that our artist made for the game. It's right here on the right. And what I did was basically she was like, okay, what do you want? And I'm like, I want him to look something like this. And I literally did it like in 10 seconds and it was horrible. And then I was like, but I like also this Pokemon right here. So if you can combine those in some way, that would be really cool. And thankfully my artist, very talented, she was like, I got you. And she just created this thing. It just felt really nice to me. I was like, wow, it kind of looks like a slime in a way. So it's just cool. Like it helped a lot. Like just giving them simple sketches, or as a designer you can do some like, it's not even, I cannot even call that art design, but it's just for visualization. It's like it helps the artist. Oh, this is a big one. So user feedback and demographic. So these are actual comments that we got from newgrounds after we loaded the game, and it's something really interesting that I'm just experiencing right now. And you're gonna get different type of comments eventually when you put games. People are gonna give you some feedback, and it's very interesting to see the different type of feedback you can get. For example, I have this one right here that says that they loved it and it's really nice. I love this one that says that this level is true bullshit, and that's kind of funny to me. Like I don't take it as an insult. It's just like fun. But then so there's things that you have to learn from feedback, and it's kind of like a very hard matter, because it's, for example, in here this person says melee controls are not good, and then the person here on the top says, for those of us not using a GameCube controller, it's kind of hard, a game controller, it's kind of hard to play this game, right? So there's obviously something wrong going on with the controllers. But if you notice, the hard thing about this is that you don't really know what's wrong with the controllers. Like, you didn't see these people play the game, so in theory, anything can be bad with the controllers. So that's something you kind of have to like accommodate for. And this whole problem was led because of a big mistake that I made early in development. When you're designing a game, you should really think about the controls as soon as you start making mechanics, because your controls is also the way that players are gonna be able to, engage in this game, right? So as soon as you're making abilities, you should start thinking, okay, what buttons are they gonna press, and how is that gonna feel, and what are my limitations? Is this weird if I jump and run with one hand while I can be doing it with another hand, separate the tasks? So those are very important things that I left at the very end of development, and it led to a lot of confusion. So think about the demographic that you're trying to aim for. When we were making this game, we first had the idea of making it for people who had controllers, but then we were like, we should load it to newgrounds. And obviously in newgrounds, people mostly use keyboards. So before doing that big step of just like, let's upload this here, just because you should really think about what type of games are these people playing here and how do they interact with these games, so you can know what they're familiar with and you can design based on that. So know your demographic and know the environment in which these people are going to be playing the game.
Alright, so this is the start of my postmortem for Planty of Buds. As in plenty of buds. As in plant buds and also friends. Don't worry about it. So, well, yeah, as you can see, puns are a big part of our game. We have plenty of buds. Buds is a pun. Planty is a pun. We have here a description: reshape levels to gain the upper land. That's, if you know Kyle Kistler, you know why this is a thing and all. But this is our game. And if you remember in the beginning, I said that we were making, that the game was a strategy game. So, looking at this, you're probably not thinking, this doesn't look very much like strategy. That's right, because we started as strategy. And some of that stayed until the end. But there's something that happened where we couldn't find the fun. And it just, something about strategy, like we couldn't find where to put it and how to make people connect with it. And so we kind of took this running joke, because in the very beginning of the game, of the game making process, I started a meme in our group. I made a joke because our producer was very heavy on like, let's not overscope this, let's not overscope this. So as a joke, I mentioned that we should have collectible monster buddies, like Pokemon. And I just thought that was funny. And then, because it made her very, very angry. And so we kept doing that. Every now and then we would like bring up like, oh, what if we added collectible monster buddies? And she would become angry. And so that kept up throughout the whole thing until we got to a certain point 5 or 6 weeks in where we realized our game was not fun. And a big part of that is there was no
Collectible monster buddies?
there were no collectible monster buddies. There was no tie-in for the player. We had mechanics because we went in. We were like, we want to make a strategy game that uses the terrain. Boom, and we started doing that, and we created abilities that affected terrain. We created this hexagonal grid and like a turn system, and then you could fight by changing the terrain, and that was kind of cool. But like, so what? Like, okay, cool. Like, I can change terrain, and like things die. And like, there was no buy-in there, and we came up with a story about you being an Earth elemental protecting the world from robots, and it just like wasn't connecting with anyone. And so we realized that we needed to make something that affected people emotionally, and we needed something that connected better with like the actual gameplay, because it didn't really feel like strategy, because the moment you like the Earth changed, right, you're kind of like, I don't know, a big part of strategy games is you're maneuvering, placing pieces, whatever, and then like you're using the terrain to your advantage, and when the terrain changes too much, that strategy kind of goes away. And so at a certain point we realized that when people played the game, they weren't being strategic, they were changing the terrain because it was fun. And we're like, okay, so this is fun, we need emotional tie-in, what are we gonna do? And then our producer was like, what if we had collectible monster buddies? And so this is our game. Let's get into it. So I'm gonna show you some of the old prototypes. This was the first version. You had this grid, you had 2 people, and they would try to, you just like change the terrain to try to kill each other. And that's what we had. And it just wasn't fun. It just wasn't. So that's why eventually we're like, okay, here's our idea. Because when we were making this, we made a very modular ability system. So you could pick like an ability like do damage or raise terrain, and you could pick like line targeting or like circle targeting, stuff like that. And you could just combine, and we had like 60 or something. Do you remember kind of how many abilities?
We did not have 60 abilities, maybe combinations, but...
Right, yeah, we had like 60 possible combinations of them.
Something like that.
Something like that. It was ridiculous. And we're like, okay, what if, what? No! What is happening?
That's
No.
okay.
No.
In the top right.
Thank you. Okay,
You were
what if,
right-clicking instead of left-clicking.
what was that?
You were right-clicking.
Yeah, I didn't mean to do any of that. So we're like, what if at the end of each level, you gain a new little friend buddy that has one of these 60 abilities, and then at the start of each battle, you can choose which ones you're going to control. And the rest of them kind of are planted like a tower defense thing. And that's what we had here. We had, here's you, here's the other guy you control, here are 3 plants that are your plant buddies that are planted, and there's like some enemies somewhere. And here's something that happened here, and then we created like a better version that I don't have a picture of. And what happened is people didn't know who they were or what they were doing. Like we would like try to do blind play tests where we wouldn't tell the players anything, and they would look at this and they're like, okay, who am I? What am I doing? And that just like broke our minds, because like of course we knew you were controlling. So here's my first lesson to you. feedback is important even in prototypes. You have so many assumptions, you have so much knowledge that your player doesn't have going into it. So like when you put the game in front of a player, you expect them to know certain things. To us, it was very, very obvious who was the main character. Who are you controlling? You're controlling these two. The rest of these are plants. Like the plants look different. They're all green. These guys are different. That didn't mean anything to of course that didn't mean anything to the players. And so they would sit there and they'd stare at the screen and they wouldn't know what was happening. And our objective was rescue the monster buddy. They're like, who's the monster? Is it these? Are these? Who am I rescuing? How do I rescue them? What's happening? Ah! So,
Question.
yeah.
Did you do playtests where you then tried to explain as much about that as you could and then see how they played the game?
Yes, yes. And here's what happened. So we explained it to them. They're like, okay, I kind of know what I'm doing, I guess. And then they just, the planted monsters, people just didn't like it. They were just there. And they're like, they don't want to do a tower defense. They want to change terrain and kill stuff and get to their friend. And like the planted monsters, the way they worked is they would use their ability over and over again, and it could hurt you. And we thought that was interesting. Oh, like your towers can hurt you too if you're placed in the wrong place. And that happened, and people were like, why is this here? And we're like, I don't know, man. I thought it would be fun. And they're like, it's not. I don't like this. So we got rid of it. Moving on. So we honed in on this design of you have a small core team and you control only one guy for a couple levels, and you get 2 and then 3, and it's like a lot more focus, and I'll get into more later. But first, I want to talk about teaching, because that was our main problem with the game. And this is a problem with any game that you have that is, if it's like, this will be true for any game, but especially if your game is not real time, especially if your game is not real time and does not use physics. Very important, put a lot of care into how you teach the player. If you have a first-person shooter or a 2D platformer, that's easy for the player to comprehend. You only have to teach like the special parts, right? Like your special abilities or special interactions, right? If you have a strategy game, you need to teach the player who they're controlling, how they're controlling, who's like the enemy, like how do you interact with this world? Because it's very abstract. So like you have this like kind of top-down view, right? And so especially with a strategy game, there's a lot like going on. So you have to teach, and you have to teach a lot. And we as game players have been conditioned to believe in this thing called the tutorial. And we also all hate tutorials. So hear me out. Our game became a lot better when we made a tutorial. So I'm going to focus on this real quick. In this tutorial, you start with one character. There are some enemies over here. There's a friend you need to save. The friend like pushes this enemy across this gap, and so you're learning. So our thought was, you're learning, oh, this is who you are. This is how you move. Oh, this is who you need to save. These are what enemies are. They can get pushed across gaps. If they get pushed more and they fall, they take damage from the fall. You have an ability that does damage. Later on, there's another friend in the same level, and they can terraform. Terraforming is a thing, by the way, and you can use terraforming to raise a lower terrain. By the way, you can't go up or down a height greater than 1. So you have to use terraforming to help you get up. You have to use pushes to push you down somewhere, because you can't just walk down that. Stuff like that. Can anyone tell me what's wrong with that?
That was a lot.
There's so much! That was like to us, those are all like core tenets of like how our game operates. And we wanted to teach it all in one level, because we're like, this is all core to the game. But it's too much. It's so much. Yes, we are teaching everything.
But we're teaching it all together in this giant clump of like all this stuff. So much so that I had these giant text boxes like describing what was happening and how to do the like shit. Huh?
I've never even seen that iteration of the game.
Yeah, that was before you.
Yeah.
It was like wild, and people like they figured it out, but they didn't enjoy it. It was bad. It was slow. It was like it just felt bad on so many levels. So, what's something like? How can I teach all this to someone without having this mistake? What would be a better way to teach this?
Break it up into pieces and teach them one at a time.
It's so easy. It's so easy. And like, so I kept having this issue. I had this issue recurring throughout like the last few weeks where as a level designer, I was like, we have very little time. I saw that. I saw we have like, at this point, I think we had like, what, 5 weeks left?
I thought it was like 4, but
We had like 4, oh God, wow, I did a
we
lot
had
in
like
4
2
weeks.
meetings with mentors and then it was done.
Yeah, you're right.
That's like in terms of like 5 weeks of episode.
Jesus. Okay, so 5 or 4 weeks. That's not a lot of time. So in my mind, I was like, I can't make too many levels, right? Because the more levels, the more work. So I was like, I need to condense as much as possible into these levels. The fallacy being, I'm putting even more work on making each one of these giant levels interesting. So like, so what I did is I broke it up, and that was more levels. I broke it into 6 levels. I'll get into that a little bit, but eventually I broke it up into 18 levels, which is wild. I didn't count as I was making them, and then like while we're like doing our showcase, someone asked like, how many levels is this? And I counted in my head, and was like, 18. Yeah, so don't do what I did. Like plan ahead. Pre-production, yes. Plan, I didn't. It was bad. Anyway, so this is kind of what we ended up with at the end. Here are the things you learn. This is who you control. This is where you can walk. This is where you need to go. Your ability can let you cross gaps. That's all you learn. There are no enemies in this first level. Combat is a big aspect of our game. Terraforming is a big aspect of our game. Neither of those are in here. And you know what? That's okay. Yeah.
Puzzle solving is also a big aspect of game. And
Yes.
very
That-
minor here too.
So that's something that you're gonna have to reconcile with yourselves, because this is a problem that like whenever I've consulted several designers as they were trying to make their first level in the game, in their game, and I've dealt with this a lot too. There's a certain level of challenge and fun that you as a designer want to be in your first level that does not need to be in your first level. Looking at this is not challenging. When I look at this, I'm like, this isn't fun. This is nothing. I'm just walking, and then I dash, and then I walk, and then it's over, right? But like, for someone who is just jumping into your game for the very first time, they're okay with it, because they just want to like. Here, they're gonna learn how to move the camera around, how to like move your character. There's space for them, like, oh, I'll dash across this. I'll try to get onto one like that island, like just for fun, like. There's a little bit of space for the player to, like a little bit of a safe space for them to play, and I think that's okay. I think we have this pressure that we put on ourselves to make the game, like, make the game what the whole game is going to be in the very beginning. And there are a lot of people who believe that's what you should do, and in some cases that's true, but especially on something like a strategy game or something like that where it's a lot of it's very complex. There are a lot of moving parts you need to teach the player. I think this is okay, because here's how it changed the player experience. We wanted the first 5 minutes of the game to be more fun. Here, yes, there was more challenging. There were more interesting things happening, sure. But it was less fun because those first 5 minutes was the player panicking, trying to figure out what to do. These first 5 minutes were, I crossed this thing, oh, hey, I won the first level. Yes, it wasn't a challenge, but I won something. That's important.
Mind if I jump?
Go ahead.
Can I add to that?
Yeah.
So adding to the level design stuff, also in Chibino we encountered this, and you might have heard this already if you come to the Wednesday level design workshops, but pacing is very important when you're making levels, and we also encountered that on Chibino in a platformer, which is interesting because they're so different in genres, right? And when I was first making levels for Chibino, I had this idea of like every level should be at least like 2 minutes long, and I want to like make them to feel like a complete level rather than a very short level. And I reached this point in which I was making levels on paper and they had no purpose, and it was just either just a random challenge or it was just not serving anything but length. And at that point I felt like obviously the game felt boring. The game had like something missing. And then I started to pay more attention to pacing and to introducing things in different times, right? Like how Chibino is divided is that in each chapter, level 1 of each chapter you get a new partner ability and you're introduced to it. Level 2 is a little more challenging, and level 3 is a boss. So we use that same pattern for all 3 chapters, and it worked better than just introducing all mechanics at once, because you know when you're trying to keep the player engaged, right? One of the best things you can do is by rewarding them with a new mechanic. It gives them, you know, this curiosity. It makes them, oh yeah, I have this new power and I want to, you know, use it, and it just feels great instead of giving everything at once, right? Like any game that you play, like Ori or Hollow Knight, or you don't start with all your arsenal, you build from it, and how you build this pacing really depends on your levels and on the game genre you're trying to build.
That actually, I wish I had put that in here because I didn't. But so there's something you said about the pattern of your levels.
Yes.
So here's just like something like if you're trying to design levels for your game and you get like stuck, you're like if you're trying to design like any kind of like I guess like part of your game, or a tool that can help you is having a pattern, and this is great for level design because especially if you have chapters or worlds or anything like that or abilities, you can have an arc for each one, and for each one you kind of have a structure to build from, and that helps you as a designer know how, like what to build and when. That also helps the player know what to expect. That also gives you a powerful tool that you did not have before of breaking the formula. That's interesting. That's something you can do now. So that's something that I did for this game, where you get a monster bud. So first you start with this character. You get to the seed, and then you have 4 levels of just killing enemies. After those 4 levels of just killing enemies, you have a level kind of shaped like this, except at the end you have another plant bud. And it's not about killing the enemies, even though there are enemies. It's about getting to the plant bud. You get to it, you have 2 now. And now there are 4 levels of you killing enemies with 2 abilities, right? Because your new plant bud has a separate second ability. So you're managing 2 abilities, and you kill 4 enemies. Then you collect your 3rd guy, and then this time I think you have 3 levels of just killing enemies, but you're managing 3 abilities. So this was just like giving you time to learn your ability before you gain a new one, right? And that just made the game like a million times better. And also made it so it ended up with 18 levels, which was a lot. But here's the thing. Previously, I was just making level after level of like, these are things that you can do in this video game. And like, it was aimless and it was really difficult. When I had this structure, I'm like, okay, I have this ability, 3 interesting things that I can do with this ability, make them into enemy killing challenges. Good. So what's something interesting about this ability of like that I can do about getting this ability? Okay, I have that. now I have these 2 abilities. What are 3 or 4 interesting things that I can do with these 2 abilities? And that like just builds on itself automatically, and not automatically, but like thinking about your level design in terms of your actual mechanics, very important. I'm going to do a workshop about that next week in the level design workshop series. Wednesdays.
4:30.
4:30
to 5:30. Is that
to
right?
5:30.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Very great.
I'll be here and I'll do that workshop. So, okay, clear feedback is very important. This is just a side note. This is real quick. This is something we added very much later, and it like made our game a million times better. Like, you can't move up heights greater than 2. So I created this little section and added this like line that shows you like your character's movement path. So when you look at this, like, yeah, like when I look at this, it's like obvious, duh, like you're climbing up this, and then you like know that you can't jump up this like intuitively without actually having to devote thought into it. Whereas before they would just see these like squares and they'd be like, why can I walk here but not here? And it was confusing. But now it's like, yeah, duh, like I have to climb up the steps. When it's not duh, it's just like you have to show that to the player. So like prediction systems like that, very useful. We have here, your ability is a charge that when they hit an enemy, the enemy like flies backwards. So I don't know if you can see it from like where you are, but there's a red line coming from the enemy and going down into the lava. There's a green line coming from you to over here. So like, yeah, I'm gonna dash over here, the enemy's gonna get pushed off and into the lava. And then your mind can be like, lava equals death. Yeah.
What are those black spike beams?
Black.
That's so foreign.
This, oh yeah, it's like a gray translucent version of yourself, like a little ghost to show you. This is where you're gonna end up. Yes. Any other questions so far, by the way? I've been talking a lot. Yeah.
Why is the ability above that other bar?
That's an example.
Okay.
What did you say?
UI overlapping.
Yes. Yeah, there's a reason for that, which is that we ran out of time. Because we did our UI at the last minute.
Not advisable.
Last slide.
UI is important.
Make UI UX at the beginning.
Yeah.
I mean, it was interesting because all throughout the development, we were like, UI is the most important thing. We need to be focusing on this. How can we better serve the UI to give information back to the player? Even still, things like that.
Yeah.
Final thing.
Well, because we were focusing on like in-world UI like this, we like didn't like do any of that other shit. Man. Anyway, so little victories. This is a term that our mentor used a lot. That I want to share with you guys because like there aren't really classes taught about this. I mean there are, and it's usually like in terms of flow and pacing that people talk about this kind of stuff. But I think that the term little victories helped us a lot out. Like I said before, I used to try to condense a lot into one level. And so I had the level where you get a new bug, and then one level where you test out your abilities, and then a level where you get a new bug, and then one level where you test out your abilities. And the testing ability part, that's what it used to look like, as you can see, or you may not be able to see from where you are. But here's you. Here's a lane with a couple enemies, and there's kind of like a challenge here. There's a lane over here with an enemy, and a lane over here with an enemy, and each lane teaches you a different thing about your push. And that to me was really interesting. Like, oh, you have like 3 directions to go, and then each one teaches you a different thing about your power. Any ideas why that's bad?
You gotta walk back.
You have to like walk back and forth like in the same level. You walk over to do the same thing. Walk all the way back over to the other thing. Walk all like. I could have just yeah. So there's no reason for them all to be in the same level. Except that in my mind it was like as little levels as possible. Which doesn't make any sense in this context. So this is an example of one of the final levels. This like here, this interaction is the same one that I'm having here, except because it's its own level, I was able to add an extra puzzle thing here where you're supposed to use this guy's ability to push this guy across the chasm, and that was interesting because it was a puzzle. And so instead of just being like, use the ability, oh, now I know how to use it, here it was like, there's a puzzle, and you solve the puzzle, and then the puzzle intuitively, you know exactly what to do with your ability, and like, oh, I learned something new. But you don't think about learning something new, you think about, I win, right? Here, it's like, imagine like 15 minutes, and then like one victory, okay, I won that level. 5 minutes, I won. 5 minutes, I won. 5 minutes, I won. So, here's where little victories comes in, and this is very important. In that first giant level we had, where you learned a bunch of stuff, people would spend like 15 to 30 minutes on that one level, and they would win, and then that would be like one victory. Now, within that same time frame, people win like 8 levels of our game. And that feels better. That makes people feel good. So think about that when you're designing a game, and this doesn't even only apply in a level design sense, but like try to place little victories where your player can reach them, instead of having this giant thing where they like work a lot and then one like medium victory. Like do like a bunch of little victories. That way they always feel like their morale going up, they feel like they're getting better. Yeah.
Also, that separation helps a lot, because when we had that one level where it was very dense,
Yeah.
people may have got stuck at that one point we had to push a unit off.
Yeah.
Just like, did I mess something up at the beginning? I think one person restarted and we're like, oh no.
Oh boy.
Yeah.
This is all stuff you've already finished.
If you
But they
attempt
didn't know, because it was still part of the same level.
If you tend to have a section that you only want them to have to do once and then they understand it, then the way this is set up means that if you mess up the other sections and die, or you choose to restart, you have to actually do all 3 at once to beat the level, which makes more sense to separate it if you only want them to do it once.
Yeah. And that brings me to my next point. Restarting feels bad. Think about that, right? When you have a giant level and there's an important puzzle part of it at the very end, people are going to be very hesitant, right? They're not going to experiment and try things because they're scared, because if they die or if they mess something up, they have to restart the entire thing. That's a lot of time wasted. And that's something that we experienced. This is actually one of the final levels. There was a puzzle that we grew attached to. And this is a whole other, so I'll get into that. So there was this puzzle that we wanted to do where you know that when an enemy hits you, you get pushed back. So the idea was, oh, the puzzle is, instead of killing the enemy, you have to let the enemy hit you to push you across a chasm. And that was very hard to get through to people's heads. People just didn't think about enemies in that capacity. They thought of enemies as something to kill. So we created this level where you go up to that top left part and that enemy pushes you across. You can't avoid that. You get pushed across by that enemy. So you learn, oh, enemies can help me. So the idea was that you would then go down and then cross over there, and then the enemy would push you down that way, and then you'd be able to progress. And that was, to us, that seemed like it was interesting. But people would get through there, they would get to the enemy, and then they would try to kill the enemy. And then when they killed the enemy, they didn't want to restart because they didn't want to go through everything again. So they would like mess around for a long time and then eventually restart. And then they would get to the end and they would sit around for a long time trying to like figure out like what are they supposed to do. And then the enemy would like hit them and push them in the wrong direction or something and mess up. And like someone like actually said like while we were playtesting, they were like, I'm hesitant to try things out because I don't want to like restart this whole thing. So think about that when you're putting someone in a position of, especially like particularly unintuitive puzzle or puzzles in general. If you have a problem that needs solved by your player, that isn't just like, also reflex problems. So mental problems, reflex problems, anything that might require trial and error, you want a fast iteration time on that because that only breeds creativity.
Any questions about that? Okay. All right. Okay. So I'm running out of time, so I'm not gonna go like super detailed over this. I actually talked a lot about this. A little bit. Oh, wait, hold on. Sorry. Something about this puzzle. We probably should have gotten rid of it because people didn't like it and it wasn't intuitive. So don't get too attached to your puzzles or your any idea. If you have an idea and it is not working, do not sink a week into trying to get it to work. I don't care how much you like it. If you're spending too much time on it, come back to it later. Do something else, please. This was a mistake. Okay. So, finding the fun. Yeah, so I talked about this. We couldn't find the fun. The terraforming was fun, but it just like wasn't connecting with people. So when we added the collection of monster buddies, people became emotionally attached to the monster buddies. And here's what happens. You're no longer just messing around in this terrain world, fighting enemies and like whatever. It's like, this is like my little bud, my friend that I like, and I want to protect them. I want them to win, right? I want to save these little guys. So then you become emotionally attached, and then when you like do a fun like terrain thing that like sinks a bunch of enemies into the lava, like yeah, that's satisfying. They sank into the lava, but also like yeah, like I did it. Like I'm protecting these little buds. So something to think about. This is something Luis talked about in the beginning, like the why, how, what chart. That applies a lot to your teammates, but it also applies to the player. You want to sell the player on the why of your game. Like, why are you doing this, right? There's like an emotional core to your game, and it might just be like, fucking around in it is pretty fun, like, and that's okay. But like know what that core is of your game, and like sell that. And to us, it eventually became like this kind of like the emotional appeal of these little buds that were funny, I think. So playtesting is important. Here's how, just two examples of how playtesting helped us find the fun. The tower defense thing wasn't working. People thought the towers were getting in the way, so we scrapped that. Done. Like, you don't need that shit. If it's not connecting, like, and it's not important to the game, you don't need it. Get rid of it. It's not important. It's just extra work. Get rid. Okay. So at a certain point, I made 4 levels, and that was back in when I had that giant tutorial. But in the second level, there was one moment. So the game was really shitty. Like these 4 levels were just like hecka bad. But in the second level, there was this part where you collected this new friend that lowered terrain in a circle. And so if you use that ability too much in one spot, you sink into the lava, right? So making lava is good for killing enemies, but it can also kill you. But you had this other friend that raised terrain in a circle. So you had to overlap these circles, right? And that was interesting. You had like these enemies, and the terrain was low, and you would overlap circles, stand in the right place, lower, kill enemies, you didn't die. Raise terrain again, move over here, lower, and then like, when people played that, they were like, this is kind of fun, and they would play the rest of it, and they would like, it wasn't fun. It was a bad game, guys. The title of this presentation is Two Bad Designers. Come on. So, given that information, right? Say you have 4 levels of a really bad game, but there was something good in your game. Your game made a fun experience. What do you do?
Make the game that notes so you remember using in the future.
Okay, but like, right, but
Or the fun experience, keep on going with the rest of the game.
okay.
The exact opposite of what I
Perfect.
said.
Find the fun.
Yeah.
So that was a little nugget of fun that was in a bad game. But that proved something to us. The whole idea wasn't bad, its presentation was bad. We saw in that moment that our system had potential, right? These overlapping circles, they had a potential there. There was like, that moment was kind of puzzle and kind of combat, right? So, previously, what we had in the game, the way it was designed, is you had like this kind of like puzzly area and this like combat area.
and that was like the only point where the puzzle and the combat were like mixed in together. So we got rid of all of the just puzzle stuff, and we got rid of all of the just combat stuff, and we created little moments of puzzle combat, where you have to think about the terrain and the enemies and like how they interact in interesting ways, and created a bunch of these little moments as their own levels. And the game was okay. There you go. We had someone who works at Blizzard play it for an hour and a half, and they did not get bored. They also did not win the game, but they had a good time, and they played it for an hour and a half.
What?
Yeah. A designer at Blizzard spent an hour and a half playing
And
the
they
game.
didn't beat it?
No, they didn't beat it. Someone else spent an hour playing the game and did beat it.
I don't remember how long it took me.
Right. Yes.
How long was the production of the entire game? Like the timeline?
20 weeks.
So half a quarter. So like
2 quarters.
It's like 2 quarters.
2 quarters, yes. So, with that in mind, strategy games are hard to make, but more importantly, it's hard to find the fun, so I wouldn't recommend it for a 10-week thing. But just keep that in mind, just like real quick. So we spent 20 weeks making this game, and only at the end did we find the fun. Me and Kyle and some other people worked on a different game for a class where we only had 3 weeks to make it. Was it 3 weeks or was it less than that? Chopping block.
Still free.
We had like 3, maybe 4 months. I felt like we had more than a third of the quarter. Maybe like, I mean,
I
the
think it
game,
was-
we made 3 games in that class, so like a third of the quarter.
Yeah. So it was like 3 or so weeks. Within like half a week, it was fun. And the reason why that is, in my opinion, is that the visceral experience of moving a character around in real time, it's just like, it's a lot easier to make fun, like right off the get-go. And so just something to keep in mind. If you have something that plays with physics and real-time shit, like, it's a lot easier to make that fun right off the bat. If you're working on a strategy game, before you start, stop and think really hard about like, how are you going to draw these people in? How are you going to create fun out of a purely mental thing? Because you don't have the visceral experience of moving, like using a controller to move this character that's jumping around, watching things move like that. That's like instinctually fun. So if you're not going to have that in your game, you need to compensate with really good level design, real good systems design, and just like good puzzles.
Feedback for everything.
And feedback for everything is so important. Good UI, good particles, good. Do it. Okay. Any questions?
You gonna talk about other games that you designed?
Nope. That's the end of this.
I guess
Oh.
something to looking at. Oh, should I?
I had one more slide.
Let me go for it.
It's okay. It's like 5 lines.
Go for it.
Okay. The bottom line is that you have to use collectible monster buds,
Okay.
and that's a joke. Just give yourself time to find the fun, and make sure the player knows what's happening, and then have fun making your game. And that's my bottom line. It's right there in the bottom.
Can I actually add one thing?
Yeah.
If you have jokes repeatedly during development, they will eventually become mechanics if you give them enough time.
Yes.
Monster Buds were a joke, they became a mechanic.
Yeah. I started with that. I love
Base all
monster
of your
buds.
mechanics on jokes.
Huh?
Base all of your mechanics on jokes. Because I mean, if
Someone
someone writes a
else.
joke well enough to continue to repeat it, there's something interesting there. I'm not saying make all your jokes into games,
Yeah.
I mean, good God, but like,
I think we brainwashed Tina into wanting to put collectible monster buds in her game. I don't regret it.
subliminal messaging.
Yeah.
Oh, another thing to add.
Yes.
To I guess to go back to the feedback and stuff.
Yes.
This is actually a conversation I had with a level designer on Blizzard, and we're talking about making levels and stories, and you know how like you have like a really cool mechanic, and you have this really cool thing that you really care about, right? And like let's say you have like a rocket launcher, right? And you really put a lot of time into this rocket launcher, right? And you care about it, and you make a really cool level with it. And you have a player, and he comes and he says, "I fucking hate rocket launcher. I don't care about this." And that's something that can happen, and that's very real. So at that point, there's like a trade-off that you can do. It's one, you can try to accommodate for different type of people because you want to be inclusive, right? And there's always ways around making a level that will fit everyone. But at the same time, you're gonna realize that it's impossible to please everyone. And that goes back to something that a very wise designer said once, that was, you don't want to make levels that people have like a whatever opinion about it. You want levels that create strong emotions. It doesn't matter if it's a good one or a bad one. Because if you have something that creates strong emotions, the ones who have good ones, they will love it. And yes, there will be some people who will have a bad experience with it, but, and yes, you should try to minimize it. But if you try to compromise everyone in this story, this mechanic, then we're gonna get it's gonna be a 50-50 and then nobody's gonna be happy. So try to compromise that.
I have an interesting comment. So you were saying that games with movement are more inherently easier to be fun right off the bat than strategy games.
Yeah.
You mean so like for turn-based games and stuff like that. What do you think are some like small things you could focus on MVP-wise, player feedback, that would really focus on where the fun is of strategy games? Like if games are like you could focus on, oh, in strategy games they control a unit and they kill other things. If we make killing a unit with another unit fun by clicking on stuff, is that like sort of the essence? Because I feel like you focused a lot on overall level design of your strategy game and how that was affecting things.
Yeah.
But it seems like you were struggling with finding where was the player interaction with our game, the fun part, and that was sort of maybe reliant on feedback and UI stuff that was still in development. You couldn't really test early on.
Yeah.
So if you wanted to, say, create a more in-depth strategy game, or like if somebody's trying to design a strategy game, what should they focus on early on to get those like player feedback moments to see what's fun in the game based off of just how you interact with it?
So first off, I wanted to make a quick addendum because I did say strategy games because this is a strategy game, but I think that applies to in general, real-time versus not real-time games.
Okay.
Because again, like something about physics, it's like in movement is just like fun. Kyle, do you have something to say?
I mean, yes, but I can go after.
Okay, so I guess here's my take on it. I am not an expert in this. I only had this experience of very late being able to figure that stuff out. Early on, things that I wish I had done. Try to list and just have an idea of what might interesting moments be in the game and try to replicate that. So, for example, when we made our prototype, we made 2 characters and the ability to change terrain. That was important in the very beginning. But like somewhere around the like 1/3 line, we just kind of kept going, where there were certain things that we should have tested, which is like, given like abilities and like how enemies work, like try to like, you don't actually need to build a prototype of the game to like start thinking about it, thinking about this particular thing, but like try to come up with interesting ways that things could interact. So for example, the raising things and lowering things circles interaction, that's something you could have like, you didn't need the game to like know that like that might be interesting for someone, right? So my first thing that I would say is try to think ahead and maybe paper prototype, like just interesting interactions, like what might be fun, because in the beginning we're just thinking like, oh, this is a strategy, so as long as the player is strategizing, they're having fun. But there's a part between strategizing and having fun, which is interesting moments. So if you can figure out what interesting moments can happen in your game, then you can figure out some things that might be fun. So that's one thing. Another thing is, yeah, feedback. Feedback is important and good. It's hard to test that early, especially because your mechanics might be changing a lot. I don't know, Kyle, what did you have to say?
Something specifically for strategy games that kind of led to our game being far longer than we expected it to. The game largely exists for players in their head. They're not giving actions most of the time. They're just there thinking about, well, I could do this, well, I could do that, forming strategies, and then maybe acting on them. In order to support that type of behavior, you have to give the players enough information of what would happen if you were to execute this move. I would argue that Into the Breach does that so well because their UI is so strong for, you don't have to execute this move and then regret it. You could hover here and instead see, okay, well, having that is important for any strategy game because it's not real time. You need that sort of real-time-ish feedback to potential outcomes. I would argue the real-time versus not real-time thing you were saying before is so intuitively understandable because many individual frames of feedback, you can see things changing and react to small changes, whereas no one has intuitive understanding of what chess is until you learn it. You don't know a move until you do the whole thing, the entire move state changes. So you need feedback before it happens for integer space things.
So that's an interesting thing. One way to help that happen, right? So I mean, one way to phrase that is that like your game isn't real time, but your feedback should be. So like for a game, like there's that line going to where you're gonna go. Like that's real time feedback. Is something that's not happening in real time.
Okay, so in the early development of strategy games, do you think it's more important to focus on the potential strategies and interesting moments, or on like juice and feedback and how it feels to physically move a player and to physically kill an enemy versus the actual mechanics and systems of interesting systems?
I think you need to think about both, but I think the most important thing is that I would say in early on, definitely like the strategy stuff, because you don't want to have feedback for things that turn out to not be fun, and then you scrap and then you wasted that time. They're both important, but I think like, yeah, I don't know.
We're over 12 minutes.
What?
We're over 12 minutes.
Oh boy. Okay. Yeah, the workshop is over, but you can ask more questions if you want.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you. You're free. Sorry for taking 12 extra minutes.